schizophrenia, typically you see the onset in, young adulthood, late adolescence, your early 20s, basically. And famously, you hear this often that schizophrenia can be precipitated by some type of stressor at that time period in your life. People will often talk about, if you have a genetic predisposition, say to schizophrenia, or it runs in your family, you should avoid psychedelics because they can trigger schizophrenia to emerge, or adolescent use of THC can trigger schizophrenia to emerge in someone with a predisposition. To what extent is that true, and what do we actually know there about these precipitating factors?
So we can think about precipitation in different ways. So let's talk about, on one side, substance-induced psychosis.
Mm-hmm.
That's a real thing. You see it with cannabis. You see it with hallucinogens, psychedelics. You see it with methamphetamine. And when you have substance-induced psychosis, there's usually three paths that happen after that.
And before you go on, so when you say substance-induced psychosis, are you talking about the onset of permanent schizophrenia, or do you mean the onset of a temporary and reversible psychotic state?
An acute psychotic state induced by substances. And that's where I'm going to get into what the potential outcomes are. In the first case, you actually do end up going from having an acute psychotic state to an organic psychotic disorder.
Mm-hmm. So an acute psychosis precipitated by drug use can sometimes turn into a long-lasting psychosis.
Yeah. The second one is that you stop using the drug completely and you never have a psychotic episode again. And that's where, there's some level of self-selection as well that happens, right? And so even with cannabis, where most people will be like, well, I never experienced such a thing, or I've never had a psychotic episode, or I've never felt, even though THC is a psychotomimetic, people are like, I've never experienced such a thing. Well, it's because the person that tried it for the first time and had a bad trip never tried it again.
Yeah. The person who takes the edible and has a temporary acute psychotic-like state probably doesn't try it again.
Try it again, right? Yeah. So there's a selection bias that creeps in when people generally talk about this, right? And that's why nothing polarizes people more than cannabis, whether cannabis causes schizophrenia or not, whether it's a psychotomimetic or not.
Oh, I mean, I'm sure we'll get into this, but as someone who worked in the marijuana industry, I mean, this is just a huge issue. You've got one pocket of people that think cannabis equals psychosis, and you've got another pocket of people that says cannabis can't possibly cause psychosis because I enjoy it.
Or in that, but also they'll say, oh, well, cannabis has gone up in potency. Why haven't we seen an increase in the prevalence of schizophrenia? And those are all real valid concerns and questions. Like, I actually tend to find myself somewhere in the middle of both those questions. And I think we need more people in the middle. And I have colleagues that who are preclinical scientists who swear that THC causes schizophrenia. And on the other side, I also have preclinical colleagues who are like, THC does not cause schizophrenia, right? And I think the truth is still somewhere in the middle. And I think it's important to have that nuance when we talk about it. So going back to the thing from the sort of three paths. So one is you develop an organic psychotic disorder. The other one is you never go back to it again. And the third one is anytime you use the substance again, you do have that acute substance-induced psychosis, but you don't have a chronic psychotic disorder.
I see. So let me summarize for people, because this is important, and I rarely hear people sort of bucket things this way. So there are a variety of drugs that are associated with the induction of psychotic states of different kinds. The big ones that often come up the most are methamphetamine, hallucinogens, including certain psychedelics, and things like THC. And there are sort of three ways that psychosis can be induced. One, it's temporarily induced, but then that temporary acute psychosis transitions into a chronic form of psychosis, such as schizophrenia in some cases. The second thing that can happen is there's a temporary psychosis, but then when the drug goes away, so does the psychosis. So it's just sort of a side effect of the drug in real time. And then the third is that someone will have that temporary psychosis every single time they try a substance, whereas someone else might just have it once if they try a lot, but they don't have it every other time they try it.
Yeah, so that basically captures all of that. And I think, and so where you then see it in terms of precipitating And even when this relationship between cannabis use and schizophrenia, where there's probably real signal is in two places: prevalence
Mm-hmm.
and age of onset.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a greater prevalence of schizophrenia in those that use cannabis during adolescence, from the Swedish conscript studies and others, and there's a lower age of onset. And so, especially with higher THC or more potent forms of cannabis, you do have an earlier age of onset of schizophrenia. So I think that those are the sort of places where you can see it show up.
Yeah. I want to unpack the relationship between cannabis and schizophrenia a little bit further. I want to take a minute to sort of summarize what I understand to be sort of the state of the literature on this and why perhaps there's a lot of confusion and antagonism between people on this point. So the question is, does cannabis use have a relationship with schizophrenia? Is it causally related to the onset of schizophrenia? And there's questions here related to onset of use. Do you start using it earlier in life versus later? Potency, are you using a relatively potent or less potent form of cannabis, et cetera, et cetera? My sort of bird's eye view of the literature here is, okay, if we just look at the correlation between cannabis use and schizophrenia, there obviously is a correlation there. Nobody disputes that. The question then becomes, okay, is this a correlation that represents a causal linkage, or is this a correlation without causation issue? And then there's a bunch of studies. There's a bunch of correlational epidemiology style studies. There's a bunch of twin studies out there, and they can try to control for as many confounders as possible. And some of them do that, and they come out saying, yes, indeed, there does seem to be some relationship that could be causal between early adolescent use of THC and onset of schizophrenia. And then there's other studies, twin studies, that control for various confounders, including genetics by the nature of a twin study. And they say, actually, when you control for the right confounders, there is no relationship. This is probably correlation, but not causation. I suspect that, as you mentioned earlier, this is an issue where the answer is somewhere in the middle, and there probably are genetic and environmental factors that mean that there is a causal linkage for a subset of the population, but perhaps not for everyone. What is sort of your take on the causal linkage between adolescent THC use and schizophrenia, and what the literature says in totality?
Yeah, so if it's okay with you, I'll get into a little bit of causation versus correlation, a little bit where that comes from and what that technically means, and then we can get into the cannabis and schizophrenia a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So there's this Hill 1965 Hill's conditions for causation, right? And so some of the things that they talk about in it, does an agent cause a toxicological response? And it was in the context of tobacco smoke. And so the 7 conditions, and I mean there might be more, but they are the strength of the association, so whether there's a relationship between the independent and the dependent variable, the consistency of findings, the biological gradient, is there a dose response? As the dose goes up, as the amount of THC gets higher, do you see this temporal sequence, which comes first, the chicken or the egg, or the cannabis or the schizophrenia? Then there are the biological and the theoretical plausibility and the mechanisms of action, and then coherence with established knowledge. And so there's no other competing hypothesis that might explain it. And then lastly, the specificity of association. So how closely the cause is linked with the outcome. Okay, so those are, this is an OG causation correlation criteria that Hill laid out. And so I think going through each of these kind of will help us figure out that piece a little bit.
Yeah,
and so,
there's multiple boxes to check here, and we want to see how many does THC
how many other boxes can we check, right? So then if you look at, maybe there's 12 studies, Arsenio 2002, Tian 1990, Zamet 2011, McGrath 2010, and they all sort of show cannabis exposure and then odds ratio for schizophrenia. And odds ratio for schizophrenia varies, and it's anywhere between 2, as the amount of cannabis exposure goes up, the odds ratio is anywhere between 2 to 7. And so there is, the logistic regression puts like the odds ratio across, as if you did a meta-analysis across all of these studies, around 4. And so, yes, there is a strength of association that's there. Biological plausibility. You take Cyril D'Souza's work, where they gave intravenous THC to healthy participants and to those with schizophrenia. In both the healthy participants and those with schizophrenia, it increases what's called the PANSS, the positive and negative symptom score, which is used to assess schizophrenia, right? So it increases it, and it's time dependent. You see increases in positive symptoms showing up around 10 minutes. They last for an hour, and then by 3 or 4 hours, they're gone.
So just to be clear here for people, so positive symptoms, that would include things like paranoia. So if you think people are talking about you, even though you're not literally hallucinating voices, that's a positive symptom. Obviously, some people get that when they consume a lot of THC, and schizophrenics do as well.
But yeah, no, I agree with you completely. But that's just one symptom, right? But the scores that these healthy participants got up to were like 10, 11. So multiple positive symptoms and multiple negative symptoms showed up. So it wasn't just paranoia that showed up.
Right. I mean, the other thing I wanted to point out there for people too is when we think about something like hallucinations, people often will think about like the visual hallucinations you'll get on a tryptamine psychedelic. Now, if you take something like THC, you're not going to trip in that way. It's not a psychedelic, but very often people will think they hear people talking about them in the next room, and that is a kind of auditory hallucination.
Yeah. So I agree completely, and that makes sense. The other one, and this is where it gets interesting, right? Like we talked about it earlier, the specificity of association. When one goes up, does the other. And so while, there's a paper by Keel et al. That talks about this considerably, and they said that they found no increase in the number of cases of schizophrenia. Thus there is not even an increase in the incidence of schizophrenia to explain. While cannabis use has gone up, it might not be the case. But there are some more recent studies, especially the Swedish, they do a much better job of capturing some of these things, right? And so as far as incidence of schizophrenia per 100,000 is concerned, like you've actually seen ebbs and flows, but like in the 1970s, it was around 20%. It dropped down to around 15% in the 1980s, and now in the 2000s it was around 30% or 30%, and then it's up close above 30, not 30%, sorry, I didn't mean 30%, it's in 100,000, so 30 in 100,000 versus 35 in 100,000. So, but because it's such small numbers, right, that flutter doesn't show up. It might be 1/4% or 1/2%, and so that's where I think we probably don't see it as well. But I think that where it gets really interesting is genetics. So, and this is one of my favorite papers, Pasman 2018. I think, did I send it? Maybe I didn't send it to you. Pasman 2018. It was the title of it is GWAS of Lifetime Cannabis Use Reveals New Risk Loci, Genetic Overlap with Psychiatric Traits, and a Causal Influence of Schizophrenia. So remember, this is a genome-wide association study for lifetime cannabis use. This is not a schizophrenia study.
Okay.
Whether or not you have used, and lifetime cannabis use is not the most specific outcome, right? It's rather vague. It's whether or not you've used it. So a 1 or a 0. Did you use it?
Have you ever used it or not?
Have you ever used it or not? So, but, a lot of the population would fit under a cannabis user in that condition. When you looked at the genetics, so this was 23andMe and UK Biobank, the largest possible data set that we had at that time. Some cool genes showed up. Some of those genes we're studying in the lab right now. They showed that there is genetic overlap with psychopathology generally, but a causal influence of schizophrenia genetics on whether you're going to use lifetime cannabis or not, whether you're going to try cannabis even once in your lifetime.
How do you establish a causal link in a study like that?
So this is what's called Mendelian randomization. Our germline DNA does not change. Right? Like no matter what you use, no matter what your environmental influences, our germline DNA stays the same. Right? You have epigenetic changes, but the DNA stays the same. And so what you can do is kind of look at, okay, these are the genes that confer risk for schizophrenia. These are the genes that confer risk for lifetime cannabis use. if you were to look for the genes that confer risk for schizophrenia in the lifetime cannabis use GWAS, how many of those show up there versus the other way around? So you can get a unidirectionality or bidirectionality. And so this is, you're basically randomizing. By chance, you would have expected a randomization of a Mendelian trait in one population versus another. But
Yes.
one is selectively overrepresented in one population, then
It
you can,
suggests the
yeah,
plausibility that it's
plausibility
driving it.
that it's driving, right? So
Okay.
that's where the word causality is coming from there. And so Mendelian randomization is a wonderful technique, and I think
Yeah.
you know,
So
I think,
basically, yeah, if I'm hearing you correctly, maybe one way to think about this for people is so I'm going to imagine three buckets of studies. One is a purely associational study. So you're
yeah,
simply asking, is one thing statistically associated with another thing? The opposite sort of extreme would be a cause and effect experiment that you would do in like a laboratory animal. You can inject something into an animal or take something away and really look at cause and effect directly. And these Mendelian randomization studies that you're talking about are sort of in the middle in a sense where
yeah.
you can look to see if there's a directionality to the relationship. Do these genes always or nearly always or more than often than chance predict the presence of something else, in this case, lifetime incidence of schizophrenia, but you don't see it in the other direction. And so it's not merely association, but it's also not a functional test.
Yeah, it's not a function test, and
Yeah.
but there are other studies that have done, cannabis use disorder GWASs, and actually also show, an increased risk for schizophrenia even in that. And so, but then you also see it there's a lot of overlap in traits, right? Like cannabis, you also see higher rates of smoking, and you also see higher rates of alcohol use, and those also overlap with
Right. Right.
schizophrenia. So it could be possibly explained by a third gene or some sort of pleiotropy at the genetic level, right? Like where
Yeah.
it's now the same gene is contributing to multiple outcomes. And so, but it at the very least, it suggests that it couldn't possibly be as causal unidirectional relationship that we make it out to be, right? So that's on the genetic front, but I think also what's important is the high rates of cannabis use disorder in people with schizophrenia already, and so they're already predisposed to cannabis use in some way, shape, or form. But also, I think it's important to recognize that some of these things, like even though that piece that I mentioned about temporal relationship, right? Like teens use cannabis. And schizophrenia happens when you're 18 at the very least, if not later. And so just because one came before the other does not mean that one thing caused the other.
Right.
It's just the time that those things happen.
Yeah, right.
Like,
so schizophrenia typically has an onset in your 20s, and teens typically do all sorts of stuff, including smoke marijuana.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and then even those animal studies that you mentioned, right? Like, so somebody might come and say that, oh, THC causes schizophrenia in rats, right? They also were giving a honking big dose of THC injected into an animal. And so that point that I made earlier about Cyril D'Souza's study, that was an intravenous THC. And yes, at an intravenous dose where it's 100% bioavailability, it will be a psychotomimetic. And then if you do that in an animal and give a honking big dose and you inject them 3 times a day, and you keep escalating the dose, and then you assess some, you put them in an open field and you put them whatever measures that people come up with to say it's schizophrenia, maybe it does cause schizophrenia, right? But it's not representative of what use looks like. And so in our hands, for example, when we give vaporized cannabis every day to an adolescent animal, resulting in plasma levels of THC that are much lower, like a 10 to 50-fold lower than what you might give with an injection, you don't see that shift in sensory motor gating in adulthood. Yes, you do still see changes in cognitive function and stuff, but the hallmark of schizophrenia you don't see anymore. So I think it's important that we are nuanced in even how much weight we put on the animal studies that have happened. But importantly, I think it's really important that we recognize that genetic bidirectional relationship makes it very complex. So because the people that were going to go on to have a risk for schizophrenia anyways, were more likely to try out cannabis and possibly develop a cannabis use disorder to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And do we know why that might be fundamentally? Is it because things like the dopaminergic circuitry that is involved in schizophrenia is also involved in things like motivation reward learning, the very circuits that THC interacts with?
Yeah, but also let's think about like all the potential hypotheses, right? Like there's a shared susceptibility hypothesis to what you mentioned, and this could be a genetic susceptibility like we've been talking about, or it could be a circuit level susceptibility. It could be self-medication, as it's called. And even though self-medication hypothesis doesn't necessarily hold true, so Kantian was this like psychoanalyst that first suggested it, right, in the context of depression, and then it's been sort of taken and applied to it. Not all of it holds up, right? Like if treatment non-compliance is already an issue in schizophrenia, why would you use cannabis if you don't use your antipsychotics? The symptoms usually arise or the cannabis use usually arises way before the symptoms ever come in. But also you don't see a relationship between amount of cannabis use and symptoms. In fact, people who have the most severe negative symptoms are in fact protected against substance use. Right? So self-medication doesn't always check out, but that doesn't mean that somebody who watches some podcast or some YouTube video or some friend somewhere who said, when I felt that, I tried some pot and it made me feel good. And so you're going to try it, even if it actually doesn't medicate you. You're going to be like, all right, let's try it. And, cannabis tends, especially CBD, ends up having like the best PR, right? Like, and so, we can talk about that later as well. The expectancy bias is real. And that's why a lot of things with cannabis clinical trials never come out of the wash, because it's the placebo group also shows a considerable effect. And so that doesn't mean that people aren't in effect using it as self-medication, even if it is in fact associated with worsened outcomes for them through its continued use. Right? So I think there's multiple factors that contribute to it.
So in your view, after looking at all of the literature on this, if someone just asked you, a regular person just asked you point blank, okay, does cannabis use during adolescence potentially make you more likely to develop schizophrenia? Is there a clear yes or no answer to that question?
I say there is a link. There is a link, and therefore, if there is any chance that you have any genetic risk for schizophrenia, it's better to avoid it. Or start low and go slow and stay low for as long as you can. And wait until you're 25, like all of those things, like just delay it. Just enough that you sort of cross that scary period. But I would never say that cannabis causes schizophrenia.